title of my paper is 1968 in China, Reimagining the World by Returning to the Soil. I want to start by saying that there are several 68. I'm going to explain why I choose 68 in a few minutes, but I wanted to start by saying that there are actually several other quite obvious candidates for turning points in media globalization in China. The first one is Mao's China. Mao's China was globalized in the alternative universe at the time, outside of Western domination. A number of manifestations, for example, China's connections with the third world were very strong through aid, exchange, student exchange, but also through the globalization of cultural products or media products at the time, 60s and 70s. The top-selling book of the 20th century next to the Bible was The Little Red Book, and it was a viral media product of the time. It was, a few years ago, I was part of a project on The Little Red Book as global history, and scholars from various countries studied their circulation, distribution of The Little Red Book, really, really global, 60s and 70s. And in the US, as we all know, that the Black Panthers were selling The Little Red Book on the campus of Berkeley in San Francisco, and using the funds they raised from selling The Little Red Book to buy weapons. And I read quite a bit of the underground press in the 60s and 70s here. There were all kinds of advertisements of Little Red Book. So Little Red Book was quite a global media product of the time. But Mao's China was not globalized in a different sense, in the sense that it was isolated from the West and by the West. And this is the history of the Cold War. So that's one possible candidate of media globalization as a turning point. Mao's China, 60s or 70s. Another one is the beginning of the economic reform in 1978, which really was the beginning, you might say, of China's integration to the Western-dominated media order or cultural order. Beginning from 78, gradually, but very quickly, media became more and more commercialized in China. Even the media channels became more and more officialized. The main media agencies and making them financially independent. And secondly, international media and cultural products flooded the Chinese market very quickly and in huge quantities. Initially, through Hong Kong and Taiwan in late 70s, early 80s, martial arts TV dramas, for instance, popular music, TV dramas from Japan, but then later on, Hollywood movies, and Chinese editions of glossy international magazines. All these kind of global media products began to flood the Chinese market. Really, that's the kind of globalization that I guess is what we commonly think of as globalization. That's the moment of China's integration to globalization, or rather, Westernization, leading all the way to 1989, the student movement, and the eventual government crackdown on the movement was based on the point that this movement was a movement of Westernization, was undermining Chinese culture, tradition, and legitimacy of the government party. So that's the second obvious turning point, which I'm not going to talk about. The third one is 1994, which was the year when China was connected to the internet officially. But then from then on, internet began to develop very quickly, and certainly that indicates a further accelerated integration into the Western dominated global order. 1994 was also significant in some other ways related to media globalization. It was the year where China's first non-governmental organization was established, Friends of Nature Environmental NGO, basically marking the gradual development of civil society outside of the control, relatively, of the state. Air travel became common, which was not common previously. So these are three obvious candidates which I'm going to pass. And what I want to do in this paper was to highlight a different kind of globalization, one that is characterized not by commodity flows or information flows, but by a bottom-up embracing of the world, a fascination about the world, an eagerness to learn about the outside world, a particular kind of imaginary about the world, where the outside world carries a sense of enchantment. It is a particular attitude to the outside world, which I might call for now an attitude of hospitality or attraction. I know there may be other kind of terms to describe this. By this measure, I would argue that a world connected by the internet and air travel is not necessarily more global than a world without the internet and air travel, because such connectivity, as we all know nowadays, does not automatically lead to hospitality. What we know now is, of course, that connectivity often comes with polarization, further polarization, and hostility. So I'm going to use, instead of media globalization, the idea of a world imaginary. I'm not even going to use global imaginary. I thought, I think, as we see from Aswin's remarks, and I'm sure in our conversation in these 2 days, there are issues with the concept of the global or globalization. So I'm going to use world imaginary. And the question of world imaginary is related to media globalization in 2 ways. One is how the world is imagined influences people's attitudes toward media, toward global media from the outside. And simultaneously, people's consumption of media products from the outside especially shapes the way they imagine the world. So it's a mutual interactive process. And it is in this sense that I will argue that 1968 was a turning point in China. But of course, whenever we mention 1968, we have all kinds of images, right, swimming around. 1968 was a year of global media. The whole world was watching, right? That image is a powerful image out there. Important media events, global media events happened all over the world. May 68, France. April, May, Columbia University student protest, assassination of Robert Kennedy, assassination of Martin Luther King. All these were the global events which were televised in Western, in American, so the whole world was watching. But in China at the time was a different world in the sense that television was a rare thing in China. Very few people were watching the television. And China, 68, the Red Guards were still, Red Guard movement was still raging on in the first part of 1968. They did, in their own newspapers, reported the stories in Columbia University protest in France. So even the Red Guard newspapers were covering these protest activities outside of China. That itself indicates that China was not an entirely isolated country as is often thought, right? But what I wanted to emphasize was that after, because of the violence that was going on in the 2 years, 68, 67, 68, by 1968, Mao decided to call an end to the Red Guard movement. The first part of 1968 in Tsinghua University is historically now is known as the 100 Day of Warfare in Tsinghua. Two factions of Red Guards were fighting against each other nonstop on campus. Mao decided to put a stop to the Red Guard movement and called the meeting of the leaders, Red Guard leaders, in July that year, and then that marked sort of the end of the Red Guard movement. By the end of the year, he announced that another political movement was going to start, which was called Up to the Mountains and Down to the Countryside, mainly basically sending students away from their schools, from their urban factional battles to the countryside to be educated by China's farmers, returning to the soil. That, I think, was the beginning, was a turning point in an unintentional way. So what I'm talking about is unintended consequences of that send-down experiences. In the next 10 years, about 17 million young people, high school students, sometimes junior high school students, were sent down to various parts of the country as send-down youths to work with farmers. That was when they began to discover a new kind of social reality. Then when they had time to reflect on the meaning of class struggle, the meaning of revolution, which had been the dominant rhetoric in their life and in their everyday politics. And that was when they began to develop a strong curiosity to try to understand the outside world. So I'm going to just try to focus on several things. The simple sort of argument is that through these experiences, or about 10 years, a new kind of world imaginary or global imaginary began to develop that replaced the earlier one. The earlier imaginary was one that developed from the beginning of the founding of the People's Republic in 1941, all the way leading to the Cultural Revolution. And it was articulated by some members of the generation in very powerful ways. So one article by an influential author is called "The Way Our Generation Imagined the World," is in English translation. Basically, the image of the world for this generation, before 1968, was a world divided into two camps, right? East and West, but also the oppressed and the oppressors. So it's a sharply divided black and white world, and the mission of the generation of the youth was to overthrow all oppressors of the world. That's the image, that's their world imaginary. By the end of this period, a new kind of imaginary began to appear, which began to see the world not in this kind of dichotomous images of black and white, but began to have a kind of see the outside world as a world of attraction, of even enchantment and hospitality. So 1978, what happened at the end of the year was two major historical events. One was the official policy launching the economic reform in December that year. But about the same time, a social movement happened that was called Democracy War Movement. That protesters put up posters near Tiananmen Square, demanding enlightenment, demanding democracy, freedom, rule of law, which totally embodied a different kind of world imaginary than their earlier revolutionary image of the world. They also, one of the groups, also issued an open letter, directly an open letter to President Carter, Jimmy Carter, asking for his moral support of their cause. So this, I think, is an indication of that reversal of the kind of world imaginary. So my sort of task is try to understand how did that process happen, this reversal of world imaginary. And my argument was that it has a lot to do with their media consumption of this young generation during their time being sent down to the countryside. So being aware of the time, I'm going to go over the media consumption practices of the time. I roughly divide the kind of media that they consumed into three broad types. One is illegitimate media, including, for instance, foreign radio stations, Voice of America, BBC, radio stations from the Soviet Union or Taiwan. These are considered as illegitimate media. If you are caught listening to these radio stations, you could be imprisoned. You could get in all sorts of political trouble. The second kind of media was legitimate media, official media, including official newspapers, documentary films, magazines. A lot of these, a lot of documentary films were made at the time, mainly about visits of foreign leaders to China and Chinese foreign leaders visit to outside world. So that's the second type of media. And the third is what I call restricted media. Restricted in the sense that they were, for instance, translations of Western modernist literature, like novels like Catcher in the Rye, On the Road, right? These kind of novels were translated and published for the consumption of small groups of people. So they are considered as internal publications. About 1,000 titles of these were published in the early 1960s, but only for the consumption of high-level cadres or intellectuals, for them to understand how decadent Western literature and Western life was.
My talk today actually is going to be building on research I've been doing on retro branding in Hungary, but I just want to say that that our speaker about China, in some ways lately, Randburg, a lot of the same things were happening in Eastern Europe. The images I'm going to show you don't look like that at all, so I didn't have time to sort of go into it, but many of the same practices with radio. I just found out that Russians would travel to Estonia because Estonia could get some of the broadcasts from across the water, Finnish broadcasts. Anyway, many of the same techniques of reading between the lines. Okay, so this is contemporary retro. Like these trends elsewhere in the world, retro in Hungary resurrects the fashions, designs, and technologies of the modern past as styles to be admired and mined for use today. I just want to point out this middle picture is some friends of mine had a hair party, and I thought that they were having a hair party because they had gotten onto retro stuff today, but it turns out that the Milos Forman film Hair was actually a big deal in the 80s, so not the late 60s and the 70s. Huge deal and very iconic and very important for this generation that was in their early 20s, in the early 80s. So it's sort of the anachronism of when stuff comes in on the road. In Eastern Europe, the main decades for retro happen to be the decades of Soviet state socialism, a period more associated in the Western imagination with shoddy products and shortages than with colorful modern fashions. To complicate matters further, in Hungary, as in many other parts of Eastern Europe, the communist era continues to be vilified, and if anything, condemnation of the period has intensified. The illiberal regime that Julia will refer to in her talk today has always positioned itself as purging the country of the remains of socialism, as much as it now opposes the European Union as a new threat to its sovereignty. As I argue elsewhere, Hungarian retro circumvents these problems by drawing on modern material and popular culture that was produced and consumed in 20th century Hungary, and by avoiding any explicit reference to the state socialist period. Retro refuses the geographic separation of an Iron Curtain by including goods and culture consumed at the time, whether they were cameras from East Germany or Japan, rock music from Hungary or England, or designs and fashions that transcended the communist-capitalist divide. This Magyar retro also refuses a historic periodization determined by state socialism, so it absolutely elides this 1948 to 1989 temporality. It encompasses some decades before the communist takeover and extends into the 1990s. And I don't have to say that the internet and digital technology has made a lot of this possible, just in the way people are able to share and put up, and this is Pinterest, they do it on Google, YouTube, etc. So most of what qualifies as retro relies heavily on the material from the 1960s to the 1980s, and retro aficionados have plenty to work with, particularly from the 70s. They are able to put together a vision of Hungarian modern life that appears very similar to that of Western Europe and the US at the time. There are glossy magazines and cameras, electronics equipment, rock bands, and fashion models. There's lots of people put together compilations of Hungarian supermodels, which is also sort of anachronistic. Celebrity TV announcers, spaces for leisure activities, and colorfully designed goods that conform to the aesthetics of the time. I want to point out that these are the kinds of goods that were actually necessary to produce a modern person. So they're not just symbols. That you actually need grooming products like this to be able to produce the fashions of the time. Hungarian brand names with modern, here's some other things. Modern mobility. Hungarian brand names with modern acronyms and designed logos play an outside role in Magyar retro, given that most of these companies have gone under since the fall of state socialism in 1989. None of this material has any explicit reference to socialism as a political, social, or economic system, and even in commercials from the times, there are no red stars, no hammer and sickle. There is no mention of loaded terms such as peace, friendship, worker, liberation, much less communism or capitalism. I thought I'd show you one ad quickly. This is for a soda named Marka. Marka itself means brand. So it's a branded soda, and the name of the soda is brand. No sound. Sound? Oh. Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Okay. I think it's loud enough. Okay. It gives you an idea. Such commercial imagery can be used to present an idealized vision of a world, much like the one Michael Schudson described for the capitalism of the 70s and provocatively called capitalist realism. Like socialist realism, Schudson argued, capitalist realism is also optimistic and future-oriented and presents an idealized utopian view of the world as it should be or could be, but one populated by beautiful or funny people, harmonious family relations, pleasure, and leisure activities. Disagreeable realities and difficult problems are cropped out of the picture. Like capitalist realism, the commercial imagery from the 1970s in Hungary also elides the presence of the old and infirm, poverty and deprivation, any signs of religion, rural life, as well as just the plain unfashionable. Okay, so were the TV commercials of late socialism a kind of capitalist realism? The problem is not an easy one to answer. It takes looking at what was happening in Hungary at the time, and that was a fairly radical introduction of market reforms into the centrally planned economic system. And I-Ching Wu has argued that Chairman Mao actually was looking at Eastern Europe and was suspecting that these countries were becoming infected with capitalism, and apparently that was one of the, you would know more than I would, but one of the catalysts for reforms happening in China and the Cultural Revolution. Preparations for reforms have been ongoing since the late 1950s, but most accounts also focus on 1968, the year the new economic mechanism was put into effect. These reforms included some decentralization of control over production and distribution. They also introduced financial incentives to firms that managed to produce high-quality goods for domestic and foreign markets, as they were allowed to keep a small percentage of whatever profits they made. In Hungary, these developments can be traced to the ruling party's response to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 and its brutal suppression, and yet similar shifts were underway throughout the Soviet bloc after the death of Stalin. By the late 50s, the Cold War was shifting from the train of heavy industry and militarization to into a competition to see which system could provide the better modern life for its citizens. More housing and consumer goods were important benchmarks for this competition, and over the next 15 years, modern lifestyles comparable to middle-class lifestyles in Western Europe became available to more and more of the population. The regime prioritized food supplies, greater selection and quality in clothing, more attention to entertainment, leisure time activities, and the provision of domestic appliances like fridges and washing machines. These were not just about raising standard of living. They were also envisioned as helping to transform citizens into a modern, educated, and cultured populace. Party officials recognized that the realm of cultural production was important for this endeavor, and television was promoted as a new tool to be used. But there was much debate over what kinds of cultural production to support. How much should be of high culture, so education, classical music, literature, how much civic education, and how much low culture or popular entertainment should be allowed. As Aniko Imre has argued in her recent book, TV Socialism, television as a medium was not well understood, and there was no coherent vision as to what a socialist television programming should look like. This left room for a range of genres to develop. Meanwhile, the two Hungarian electronics giants, Orion and Videoton, ramped up television production, and by 1967 there were over 1 million subscribers, which doesn't sound like a lot in the Indian and Chinese context, but Hungary only has 10 million people, so that's 1/10 of the population. And the number of people reached by TV programming was, of course, much greater, as families who bought TVs did so, in part to host neighbors and friends. The role of television in producing a modern consumer life should not be underestimated. As Mark Leahy has argued for Nepal, consumer culture takes off not when goods and products become available, but when television provides contexts in which such products are used and normalized.
So my talk is about the beginnings of illiberalism in Hungary, and since Hungary unfortunately was kind of a forerunner of this movement, if you want to call it a movement, it's also about the Eastern European region turning more and more illiberal. So we will go back a little bit in time to 2006, and if you allow a little bit of a personal note, this is the year when I arrived in the United States, starting master's degree at Yale Law School. So on the first day of classes, I walked into this lavish student lounge. It maybe wasn't lavish for Brett Kavanaugh, but you know, it was for me arriving there. And there were these huge screens. And as I was looking at them, I suddenly saw my country of origin in flames. This massive protest going on the streets of Budapest. This is a moment when they actually used the 1956 tank that they restarted from an exhibition as part of the protest. And of course, my new international classmates were asking questions. What's going on? What's happening in Hungary? And it was a very strange experience to confront that, to see your own country on CNN, no less, which, as Christy mentioned, with a 10 million person country, is not a regular experience you have to see your country there. So what happened? There is no national unified memory of the event, so even when I tell the basics to you, it's very hard to find the right vocabulary because the conservatives, the right wing, have a very different narrative of it than the left liberal side, but I will attempt to tell it in some ways. So in 2006, elections were held in Hungary, and again, the post-communist party, post-socialist party won. They were already in power. He was the Hungarian prime minister at that time, got just re-elected, and a few in a closed party-only setting got leaked to the media. So he didn't mean it for the public. It was really a close to the public session. And in this speech, he was speaking about European Union austerity measures that he was about to introduce in Hungary. And this is what he said. There is not much choice. There is not because we screw up. Not a little, a lot. Evidently, we lied throughout the last 1.5, 2 years. You cannot quote any significant government measure we can be proud of, other than at the end we managed to bring the government back from the brink. Nothing. So this was the strongest, most powerful part of the speech, and it triggered very different reactions on the left and the right. The left argued that this is a moral reckoning. This is a person confronting decades of corrupt practices in the Hungarian political elite. And the right said, no, these are unacceptable sentences, and if you say something like this, you have to resign immediately. As time has passed, now more and more people say he should have resigned, but at that point there was this clash of interpretation, strong narratives and counter-narratives. People started to gather on the streets of Budapest, and on the next day of the protest, so a day after the leak, the protesters demanded their demands to be aired on national television. So let's stop there for a second. So think about the anachronism of that. Already in 2006, you want your demands be aired on national television. This is already the time you could do it via YouTube as well. But it was still very important because it was culturally important in the Eastern European region to be on national television. So there was immediately a media component here. And since the police was disorganized, lacking meaningful leadership, the protesters were able to get into the national television headquarters. Their demands were not met to be on national TV, so they stormed the headquarters and wanted to take control of it. And once they were in, much confusion happened, okay? So they didn't really know what to do inside. Just imagine you get into the headquarters, you want it to be inside forever. Once you are in, what do you do? I mean, there's a cafe, there are studios, so you don't easily find your way. So this is my favorite photo of the event. They actually get in and they watch themselves on TV. So they sit down and look at the screen and have this moment of finding ourselves there. It's not really what we wanted, but sort of. There were also rumors spreading around in Budapest. This is a connection between Christie's talk and mine. This is a figure from a popular television show, children TV show in Hungary. And rumors spread that the protesters stole this green figure from the television headquarters, because there was like a television history exhibit going on at that time. It was not true, but think about fake news and the significance of national culture already being there, that was the main threat, that Mazsola, this figure, would possibly be stolen from the headquarters. And after hours of confusion, they left the building, leaving much destruction. They looted the cafe, the archives, and so on. This is also kind of a surreal picture, a reporter going in the next day, and there is this apocalyptic scene around him. And of course, it was a humiliating moment for the police, who felt like they were not able to protect this major national symbol, the television headquarters. So I decided to research this event directly for this workshop, and it is very hard to research it. Why? Because at the next elections in 2010, the right wing won. So this prime minister I showed to you did not resign after the events, and as a result of that, in 2010, Fidesz won, the party you hear all the time about in US media now, and they have been in power ever since. So they won 3 elections in a row. So I'm researching this in an illiberal context in which this is a very contested event, and people are worried about telling their stories. So I have this reaction from interviewees that they want to tell their story very much, but they also have strong fears and require very strong anonymity when sharing their stories. But they also want authentic history of the event. So I was surprised getting this response from people, including protesters, people in the building, policemen, and so on, that I want real history to be written, and you as a person in the United States might be able to do that. So there was that kind of reaction. It's hard to write about this event because there are factual uncertainties. Some people say that football hooligans were involved. They were the ones who actually stormed the building. But if I ever wanted to research that, that would be the mafia part of the country where I don't really want to have connections, and it would really not be safe to do so. And there's the question of iconicity versus significance. What do I mean by that? So the protests went on for additional weeks, culminating in a big protest on October 23rd, which was the 50th anniversary of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. This is the day when protesters attacked a history exhibition and restarted the tank. And they also clashed with police, and there were hundreds of recorded cases of police brutality on that day, leaving a lasting mark on right-wing psyche when it comes to trusting authorities and the police. So do you focus on the storming of the headquarters because that's an iconic place? It's television headquarters. Do you focus on the stream of events? And you might ask, why was this event a turning point? And I have multiple answers to that. One is the site of the event. So this is a building that was built in 1897. It used to serve as the stock exchange until 1948, when the television moved there, the just established national television, and they were there until 2009. So you can see on this picture, it's a robust building. This is the last moment in 2006 when the headquarters of television still mattered, state television. I don't think people would want to, protesters would want to air their demands on television anymore. This is really the last moment when this physical presence of the headquarters mattered. They moved to a smaller building later on, losing this kind of significance of site. This is how it looked inside, so it aired significance, which I don't think is there anymore.